everybody. My name is Tammy Berman. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I'm an accredited collaborative facilitator for divorce. I'm the president of the Collaborative Family Law Professionals of South Florida, and I'm really honored and happy to have Ellen have a conversation with me. And for the sake of our audience, whether they be people going through divorce or professionals, my interest was really to learn from all of Ellen's experience about what she knows about helping families through the divorce process from the lens of a guardian ad litem. You have a lot of experience in that realm. And so I want you to introduce yourself first and talk a little bit about your history so everybody really knows who you are.
Well, thank you for inviting me to do this, Tammy. So I think that, let me start with this. I've been a divorce lawyer um, for over 35 years. And somehow that has morphed into being a guardian ad litem for minor children, as well as being a mediator. I'm board certified and have been board certified in matrimonial and family law since 1994. And I think that as I look back, one of my first guardian ad litem cases was a pro bono guardian ad litem case. I was appointed in Dade County, and it was actually about a family who part of them lived here, and part of them lived in really the mountains of Tennessee. Um, and we're talking probably 30 years ago, and they had outhouses and they did log rolling, and it was a very different lifestyle than the people who lived here. And one of the things that I remember learning about in that particular case was that you can't judge every family by how you grew up or your standards, but you have to learn about how they grew up, because what they did, coming from their background, didn't make it wrong or not in the best interest. It just made it different. And that was actually one of my very, very, very first cases. And I remember it so clearly because it was so different than what I was used to doing. And talking to the children and them being able to tell me about their life and their history and their background in places that we weren't familiar with. And the children saying it so innocently was just gave me great satisfaction. And I think that I've learned from that case and thereon that children really want you to listen to them. And, part of it is really not sitting up on top, but getting down and looking at them eye to eye and saying to them that you want to know what they think. And there's not a lot of people that ask children that. And sometimes what they think is a little unusual, and sometimes what they think is spot on. But it's important, regardless, for them to know you are hearing them. Even if you tell them what they're doing is correct or incorrect, or try to help them and how they're trying to enunciate or explain a situation, they just want to know that you're really, really listening. And that's what I learned from that first case, and from there on.
That's awesome. It's very cool. So you've had many years of experience as a guardian ad litem. The first question I wanted to ask you, just for the sake of the audience, some people may really know well what a guardian ad litem is, but it's still somewhat elusive to me and unclear the scope and the entirety of the role of the guardian ad litem. I can articulate the summary of it, but so I'd like you to be able to explain what the role of the guardian ad litem is, and why would a case, attorneys, I guess, petition the judge or recommend or hire a guardian ad litem?
So my definition of the role of guardian ad litem is boots on the ground. So when people cannot agree on whether it's how time sharing could go, whether there's negativity happening, whether parents think another parent's doing inappropriate things or don't know how to take care of their child or what, often it's, well, they weren't involved the whole marriage and now the child's 8 and all of a sudden they want to be involved. And people don't recognize that sometimes that happens just because of the way their relationship was, or for a million other reasons that have nothing to do with how much they love their child. So a guardian is requested often when, let's assume, and here's my best example. One parent says that they were involved in every single thing. They went to the doctors, the dentist, the schools. And I think a guardian meets the parents, meets the child, gets to know the child, and goes, and I don't mean speaks to on the phone, but literally goes to the school, talks to the teachers, talks to the principal, talks to the counselor, looks at the documentation, their information cards that parents fill out, and their and the grades and the behavior, and who was at the open houses and who was at the school meetings. And although um it and so a judge doesn't want to have the teachers come in and the doctors come in and the dentists come in and everyone come into court. So when I say boots on the ground, it's for a person to do that investigation and report of the most doctor's records now will say who came to the doctor's office with the child. So it's not about how much you love a child, and it's not about whether you care or not. It's about the allegations that people are making, and finding out what the truth or falsity of it is, or even just investigating so you can report. That the job of a true job of a guardian is to investigate and report. So it's not up to me to say whether someone's telling the truth or not, but it is up to me to say, well, you say that you were so involved in their medical decisions, but you've not went to one doctor appointment, you've not spoken to them, you weren't there when the child was in the hospital. So, it's all the records. Or a child doesn't have asthma and you see, 6 years of doctors saying they have asthma. So a lot of it with regard to what the judges need to know, I think has a lot to do with what the records find out, rather than having everybody subpoena and HIPAA rights being violated and all of that. But then after you do that and you've met with the parties and you've spoken to the doctors and you've spoken to the teachers and you've met the child a few times in the activities, you then draft a report that talks about what they told you, and talks about what you found at the schools, and reports and makes a recommendation to a court based on the information that you have received. And sometimes the judges take your recommendations, sometimes they take part, sometimes they take none of it. And
wait,
so
hold on, quick question, if you don't mind me interrupting. I hope you don't mind.
never.
Recommendation, is it always in reference to allegations made and things that are being asked, or do you also make recommendations as a general scope regarding your role, like beyond what necessarily one parent is accusing and concerned about this and the other parent is concerned and accusing about that?
Yes.
So you may refer to that, but you also may make a recommendation beyond that.
So the court, we as guardians, a group of us have tried to get the courts to delineate in their court orders, or referring a family to a guardian ad litem, what they want. Because some want time sharing, some want maybe shared parental responsibility is an issue, maybe time sharing is an issue, maybe therapy is an issue. And so you follow often what the judges write in the report they want you to follow, because they want you to recommend time sharing. Now, the judges have to make the decision themselves. And so yours is just a recommendation, as would be anybody else, but you're vested as a guardian ad litem in the child, not the parties. And I think that's where the difference lies. When you're representing a party, you may take a different stance than you would if you're representing the child.
That makes sense. Got it. So how does this role differ from social investigation is another role that I've heard of, or a function, a job that's hired to do in a court case. And I'm still learning in more detail. I haven't been trained on guardian ad litem or social investigation, but what's the difference? Why would a case elect to get a social investigation versus a guardian ad litem?
Well, it's become a little blurred. It wasn't quite as blurred when I started. More of the social investigators, they can do psychological evaluations. Guardian ad litems do not do psychological evaluations. There's a waiver of hearsay automatically in the statute with social investigators.
What does that mean? A waiver of
That
hearsay?
means that if a school teacher tells me something, and I put in the report, normally, unless the school teacher said it to the court, you couldn't bring it up. But when you waive hearsay, you could bring up anything somebody tells you.
I see. Is that in the scope of guardian ad litem and social? Are you saying that only happens in social investigation?
No, in social investigation, it's statutory, and guardian ad litem, the parties have to agree.
Oh, okay. So
Which
okay.
which most of us as guardians or social workers don't understand why they were different, but my guess would be they were drafted at different times.
Interesting. So one thing you're telling me that's different in my logic, like in regards to that a social investigator can do psychological evaluations, my logic tells me that if already the attorneys on both sides, for whatever reason, really want to enforce and make sure psychological evaluations happen, they would petition for a social investigation over a guardian ad litem. Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Like I said, I think that the line is far more blurred these days. And sometimes they'll say they want, I think the part of a guardian ad litem and a social worker used to be far different, but I think the social workers now do more of going to the houses and investigating what people say and witnesses and stuff, and come at a very different angle than guardian ad litem. And I can't say whether one is better than the other. I will tell you that, like social investigators can't do interim reports, like in the middle of a case, they can only do a final report.
Okay.
Whereas a guardian, if I see something happening that I think is an emergency, or, I could do a report in the middle, or I could ask the court for a hearing. Social workers can't really do that.
I see. And you would do that because you're concerned of safety to the kids or the effect of the kids. That would be the most
Yes,
common reason, correct? Yeah.
only because of the children.
So that's so similar. It gives you, as a non-mental health professional, the opportunity to address safety of the kids. Whereas I know for me as a mental health professional, the statute of my license requires me as a mandated reporter to report issues of safety. And so if I'm hired to do a social investigation, even though I couldn't do an interim report, if there's any issues of safety, I would make the report immediately and there would be an immediate intervention. Not necessarily that full control over, though, that may not necessarily be a good outcome, but
Well, you're mixing. So lawyers are also mandatory reporters.
okay.
So sometimes it's as simple as, and sometimes it doesn't have to do with that. Sometimes it has to do with something that's happening at school. Sometimes it doesn't have to be necessarily, sometimes about what school they go to.
Got it. So not about the,
So
have to be about the,
I've been sometimes it's about whether a child should testify or not. So it's not like sometimes somebody wants to relocate temporarily. I mean, what files a motion to relocate until the end when they're asking for a full relocation, that temporary relocation, you'll have a guardian in doing the research.
got it.
So like if someone's relocating, it not doesn't necessarily need a psychological evaluation, but
Right.
there are mental health therapists that are guardians and not
Right.
social investigators.
So is it the case that can attorneys do social investigations, or that is specific to the role of a mental health licensed mental health professional?
I personally think it's for mental health therapists because they do more psychological testing. If a social investigation usually I think requires more evaluation and testing than it's interesting because when I started, the social investigations were done by the court system. They had a separate group. They weren't really mostly privately done.
Huh.
So it was a very different specialty, I guess. And it has blossomed more into um mental health, private mental health therapists doing social investigations.
Interesting. And it's not to say that in your scope of work as a guardian ad litem, if you see the need or have a concern regarding mental health, you would then well, what is the protocol and the power you have to recommend, enforce a psychological evaluation?
I cannot enforce it. I cannot require it, but I can recommend it. And I would say normally, I mean, the guardians that I know don't recommend it loosely. So it has to have a real, there has to be a real reason for it.
So do you want to speak to that a little bit more? Just because you have so many years of experience, what would be your reasons for recommending a psychological evaluation?
Um, sometimes it's substance abuse. Sometimes it's because a parent may be not even realizing that they're bullying their child. There's so many reasons for it that, but I don't think it's just because, and this is what I think people have to be wary of as a guardian. It's not just because somebody parents differently than you.
Say that again. I'm sorry,
It's
I didn't hear
it's
that.
not necessarily because parents um parent different than you do. It
Oh,
has to be far more than that
yeah,
to request it.
right. I hear you. So after all this whole conversation, why we're meeting today, started because we really enjoyed, I think, my perspective, I really enjoyed working with you on the few cases that I did with clients that you had recommended for therapy, I think it was. And we were like, we got to get together for breakfast. And then in the midst of that, I don't know what started the conversation, but you started to just share some really like great insights and like a passion to want to share your years of experience of working with families through as a guardian ad litem through divorce process. So that was what prompted this conversation today. And so like based on that, what are some things that are like so important to you that you want parents to know from all the years of experience that you've had in working with families as a guardian ad litem?
So I think one of the things we were also talking about that we got into all these subjects is how many people think they could be a guardian ad litem and don't really do the work that you need to do it. So for example, a child's in school and he's in seventh grade and there's 5 teachers. Don't email the teachers, don't talk to them on the phone. Because when you go and and most principals and most school counselors are really willing to help you if you um if you're really showing concern for the child. And you also need to, at some level, protect the teachers because they want to teach. They don't want parents coming in and attacking them either. But if you talk on the phone or you email with them, you're never going to get the same information, because if you go and meet with them and you're meeting with two or three at a time, one person remembers one thing and another one remembers another thing, and they start feeling more comfortable talking to you. They're not going to do that in email, and they're not going to do that on the phone. So if you really, really care about the child, then you need to really be the boots on the ground. A
Yeah,
judge could call the teacher. Anyone could call the teacher. You need to go there and they need to see you in person. And I think that there's too many guardians that don't really do that work. And these are real kids' lives that are at stake.
that makes good sense what you're saying.
And so don't be lazy, then just don't do it. And don't do more for one that pays and less for one that doesn't pay. Like, you got to do the same work.
Yeah.
And the thing for parents that I think that they wholly miss is that, number one, don't talk to your kids about the divorce. You could cry, you could show you're sad. Divorce is a sad thing, separating is a sad thing, but don't put blame on it, because it just doesn't work out. And your children will always remember it. Don't talk in front of them. If you're going to be on the phone, go outside, because your kids are going to hear you. Children watch. They want you to direct them. They want rules. They want consistency. They want consistency. They don't want you asking what happened at the other house. Most parents don't realize, if they're just quiet and say, did you have a good time at mom or dad's? And then you're just quiet. And what'd you do, in a general question? Like, and this is, so if a child goes to school and they come up from school and you say, how was their day? They're going to say fine or not fine, and that's it. If you say to the child, tell me the best part of your day or the worst part of your day, they're going to start talking. Don't ask just yes or no questions.
Right.
But it's sort of the same thing with regard to, did you have a good time at mom's? So what you do, in a general sense, you're not trying to, you want to show that you're interested in what your child's doing at another house, short of being a spy. And that's a very hard line to walk, but it's not. It's just not. If your child says something to you about what goes on in another house, and you run to talking parents or text or whatever and say, our child said you did this, this, and this, and this, it's a terrible thing to do. First of all, they could get yelled at by the other parent. Second of all, if you have a 5-year-old that was with you on the weekend, was with their father or mother on the weekend, then they were at school, and then they come home to you, what they heard or thought they saw could have changed a million times by the time you get home. And it's not because they're lying, it's that their perception changes along the way. And one of my favorite stories is, I love chocolate. So, and anyone that knows me knows that. So I remember being at someone's house, and I had this little 5-year-old girl who was just smart as a whip, just really smart. So we're sitting outside, and it was around the holidays, and I asked her what kind of chocolate she liked. We were at her dad's, and her dad lived at his parents at the time. And she says, there are these little rolls, they have things inside. And I'm like, Rolos? And she said, I said, it's chocolate with caramel inside. She says, yeah, oh my God, they're so good. So I go inside to the father's house with the grandparents, and I say, so what kind of chocolate does your daughter like, or your granddaughter like? And they go through all these cabinets, and they come up with a million different things, M&Ms or, Hershey's bars or whatever. And I said, she loves Rolos. And they're like, well, she never had a Rolo in this house. I'm like, but she's in first grade, so maybe she had it at school, and you're presuming that. And here's the mistake. You presume that she had it at mom's first, when may never have existed at mom's. And as it turned out, in that particular case, I was at mom's the next week with the child, and I said the same exact question, and they had no idea she had even tasted Rolos. And as simplistic as that might sound, it's actually not, because that's what happens when your children go to school. Whether it's pre-K, whether it's preschool, whether it's regular school, they are learning not just from the teachers and their friends, but their friends' older sisters and brothers. And people are so unaware of that and so ready to pounce on the other parent that right away it's the other parent's fault, no matter what it is. And it's just children are fluid, and parents, because parents' lives stop with this, their children's lives do not, and they're fluid, and they need to understand that, and they don't, or they don't want to.
That's a really great example and story that you're sharing to illustrate the idea that where parents get stuck in the midst of conflict in a divorce, and their perception is somewhat missing some information. So what else?
Well, there's a second part of that, and that is, and also a lot having to do with schooler not being there or children being smarter than they think. So one of my other things that I notice people do is, so child comes home from um mom's house and says to dad, mom let me in there, 6 years old, and mom let me run around naked with their boyfriend there. Right away, dad's like, how could you do that? Blah, 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 blah. May have nothing to do with that. There's a case that I had where a child said to a girlfriend, how come, and it's ironic, how come your boobs are straight and mommy's sad? And by the time it got back to mom 3 days later, the interpretation was, mommy, daddy said your boobs sag. Instead of, the conversation was, one person hadn't had kids yet, one person did have kids already, and the whole interpretation of the conversation shifted when it actually was a child asking about anatomy and having nothing to do with either parent. And if the parents were married and in the same house, and it was a PE teacher that they were talking about, or mommy, they would be joking about it at night and laughing. That, oh my God, our whatever-year-old noticed that.
Yeah.
And
You know what?
parents
One of your examples, this what your example is. This just happened with this case I was describing to you before we started this recorded conversation. That if it's a one-time incident, it's like if you take a behavior and you interpret it and it's only happened one time, then there's not a lot of weight that you should really apply to that as meaning much. It's when you see it again and again. This case I was telling you about with a teen that I'm working with, and the mom really doesn't realize the emotional impact she's having. He is at her house and he takes a napkin. He's 16. He takes a napkin and it's Hanukkah, and he's like, with the match that left over, he started to burn the napkin, just like whatever, random. And I've worked with this kid for 2 years. He's the most wonderful, nicest kid. He's so thoughtful. And he's really not an impulsive teen in most cases.
right.
Anyways, so she was like, she freaked out based on the fact that he lit this napkin to see what would happen. And when she asked him, she was also upset and disturbed by his reaction, being nonchalant. And he's actually come a long way in terms of being able to withstand the emotional impact of his mom and like creating more barriers to her. Right. So his response was somewhat nonchalant, which even amplified her concern about the fact for her that he lit randomly a napkin and then didn't seem to care about it.
Right.
And I said to her, and she was like, please, and she said to me, please investigate this. She has the makings of, if she was with a co-parent that also had similar defensive, rigid responses, this could have been blown up into a case where you would be on the case. And I said to the mom, I don't have a lot of concern for that, to be honest. Will I talk about it? Yeah, perhaps I will. I know this kid so well. I do so much intensive work with him. I would start to show concern if he did that again. And then, the second time,
right.
Then the third time, okay, now we have a concern, but a random event is not something that you create a mountain out of. And this example, the Rolo, and the other example that you just gave of breasts, and like, why is one higher than the other. These are like momentary things that it would be different if there was a pattern of behavior establishing with the child,
Right.
then, so that's a thing.
It's also children. If children know that they blame it on the other parent, and those parents if a child comes home and says, I don't want to eat dinner here. I don't want you to cook, Dad. And Dad says, why not? It was like you're cooking. And she says, well, Mom doesn't like your cooking, so I'm not eating your food anymore. And the next week and he's just like, oh my God, I don't like your mom. And he gets totally into the mom thing. And then a week later, you didn't do your homework. Why didn't you do your homework? Mom said I didn't have to. And it goes back to the mom thing. And drop papers on the floor. Well, I could do it at mom's house. And it goes back to the mom things. And what this child has learned is that every time she says it's mom's told me to do it, she doesn't get in trouble because the parent gets too focused on that. And children are very smart and they'll do it every day and Sunday if you let them.
That is a really great point for parents to know. The challenge of going through a divorce and not getting into a competition and comparing themselves to the other parent, that can really inflame conflict and confuse their objective of parenting. It's not about how well you match up to the other parent at all, and each
Well,
one has gifts,
and it's not necessarily what they're saying is true.
and
They
that's
just don't want to get in trouble.
well, and
And
that's
so they're becoming brilliant at focusing on getting you to focus on somebody else. They're outsmarting you. And one of my favorite things that happened in two cases so far is that the child said, I don't want to be at your house because you have ghosts. This happened twice already in the last 10 years. And I said to the parent, okay, get a can of Lysol, put a piece of paper around it, call it ghost spray, and you're done. And they're like, oh, I said, no, I don't think there's any parent that says the other parent has ghosts in their house because it's not really something usually an adult would be wired to. So if you're getting to the extreme where you're buying into it when it comes to ghosts, then you've definitely bought into your daughter or son stuff way too much.
Yeah.
And children are going to test you as much as they could test you. So
Yes,
it doesn't have to do with the other parent. They're just testing you.
absolutely.
You just don't have the other parent to commiserate with.
That is so true. So what else? What other things do you think are to prevent the extent of conflict that you work with as a guardian ad litem? Oh, well, actually, let me ask you something, even as I'm making the inference. Is in your experience, your years of experience as a guardian ad litem, are most cases that you're hired on to at a level of high conflict? Like what's the scope of cases that you have? Are they all high conflict and that's the typical way that a guardian ad litem would ever be onboarded to a case? Or no, it's actually an equal split. Sometimes it's just these minor things and you have a lot of cases that it's moderate to low conflict. Like what's your experience of that?
I'd say 80% are high conflict.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have a guard. They wouldn't have a third person telling them what to do.
Yeah.
Who really wants somebody else telling them what they should um what they should be doing with their child? I mean, there could be real disagreements on a sectarian or non-sectarian school. There could be real disagreements with regard to relocation that have both of those may have nothing to do with the way you feel about the other parent. It may have to do with you get a job, you get married, you want to move, or it could have to do with someone's much more religious than the other or decided they don't want to be religious anymore. Those are really not high conflict cases, but
Right.
something where a judge needs a little bit more information.
That makes
But
perfect.
80% of them are high conflict. And the problem is that so 80% of guardian litem cases are high conflict, but actually only 10 or 15% of family law cases are high conflict.
Right.
So most cases in the court, even with domestic violence and all those things, those are a very small amount of what they see. Often, and when I started practicing, mediation was not required. There was no such thing as mediation. And as it went on, I would say, because I mediate often, is that 80% of cases settle at mediation. Because people don't really want a judge who will never see them again, hopefully, decide what they're going to do with their children. Now, I'm not dealing with finances at all.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of pure guardian ad litem cases.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate part is like, well, I'd say 50% of my cases when I come to the part of writing a report, and most of the time so I'm a little bit different because I'll say to people when I'm appointed, are you sure you want me to do this? Because I'd rather you keep your money and make decisions together, because I'm not going to be in your life for the whole life of your children. So, you probably know them better than I do. But if you're going to go forward, you are going to become very irrelevant in my case. Your lawyers are going to be irrelevant in my case. The only relevance is going to be your child or children. And I'm very honest about that from the very start, which I don't know that most guardians are, not because they're good or bad, but I think I'm just much more
You're trying to give them
pragmatic. I'm pragmatic about it. I'm divorced. I wouldn't want somebody else to have told me how to bring up my child.
Yeah.
And I don't think most people want them to. But all the things that they thought were a good idea from their spouse, now every single thought becomes a bad idea as a problem.
Yeah.
And so, for example, let's assume the parties live one's in South Dade and one's in North Dade, just because they ended up having to live with a family member, not because they intentionally moved apart, because that's where it ended up. And one parent wants the school which I understand you're in one school district, but every extracurricular activity does not have to be in that district. The child should be able to have friends and things in both. And they don't understand it. They double down. And it makes no sense, because you want your child to be well-rounded. Stop worrying about whether they have a Saturday game in a different area. If they were on a travel team, they'd have a different game everywhere. They go to camp, they meet all these other different friends. You can't put a child in a tiny box because you're mad at the other parent. And people don't understand that.
So if you could help parents prevent the escalation of conflict, what would be the things that would be really important for them to know based on what you've learned in your life experience?
One of them would be, when someone makes a recommendation, don't double down the other way. And not just about me. I've seen, if I have to give you my biggest pet peeve with parents, this is it.
Okay.
You get divorced, or you're in the process of a divorce. Your child's is 5 years old and she's doing a Thanksgiving play. And one of you sits on one end, one of you sits on the other end, and that your child has to choose where to go to first.
Yeah. It's not
To
cool.
me, that's where, I don't care if you sit 3 seats away from each other.
Yeah.
That way they could come to one direction. Or even, and I have this in a case that they don't get along that well, but they do under certain circumstances. So even though they both came with a girlfriend and a boyfriend and significant others, when they went to give the flowers to their daughter, just the two parents went up. And they talked about that with the parenting coordinator, and it made it easier for the child. And that's the whole point.
Yeah. That's wonderful.
When you have a parent who says, oh, I can't, when they're in kindergarten and they're graduating and there's a kindergarten teacher and a principal, and you can't even be in the same picture with them, what are you teaching your child?
Yeah.
They'd rather have a picture of mom or dad. Like I also say, there's nothing wrong with your child having a picture of the other parent in their room. Like I have a lot of respect for people that make sure that happens.
Yeah.
And I've been in guardian cases where they don't get along, but they made sure that happened.
That's good. Yeah, so it's being
But
able to put your own experience and perspective aside for the best interest of your child or children, and having the wherewithal to recognize how important that is. That's lacking obviously in your cases, that not all of them, but sounds like, and that would be a piece of advice I think to parents, is that is really to, when you're going through a divorce, to put your own experience when it comes to the kids, to really think about what the experience will be for your child when making decisions on how you act, how you behave, what you say, what you do, with the other co-parent around and without the other co-parent around.
well, and also like, one of the things I try to say to people is that your child wants mom to be the queen and dad to be the prince with shining armor and the knight in shining armor. And so you don't need to destroy their dreams because yours wasn't so great. And they forget that. And like, for example, if there's a show and your child's in 3 shows, bring your girlfriend to one, but not to all 3. Have that alone time with them. They want that alone time with you. And parents don't get that either. They're so into their new relationships that they lose sight of that too. They lose sight of the transitions. If you really want to be a good parent, then fake it till you make it. You need to put on, you're allowed to be sad, but you're not allowed to be, you shouldn't be so bitter in front of your children.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if people really, and obviously if it's a really abusive relationship, it's a little bit different. But often it's not, because it's an abusive relationship. Um,
Do you have
and
any insight as
people,
to what you think the factors are that get in the way for parents? You're making a comment that often it's not abuse. So do you have a sense of, like, from the experience you've had, a knowledge of what it is that gets in the way for them?
um, a new significant other, um, sometimes it's an argument that I think what happens is if somebody doesn't want it's usually if somebody didn't want the divorce, but it's about, regret sometimes, like, you didn't put your child in pre-K because grandma was taking care of her, and now all of a sudden you think she should be in pre-K and grandma should have nothing to do with them after school. Well, why is that? Well, does grandma have to stop talking? And that happens too. Grandma isn't allowed to say things either. And that's sort of the problem too. If grandma all of a sudden starts getting involved, grandma can't be the babysitter, even though she wasn't. So people have to be open-minded about shifting things merely because someone else can't behave appropriately. And if you're gonna lie, pretty much, if someone is doing the research and they're good, they're gonna find out. Like, you can't get everybody to lie for you.
Yeah.
But I think parents get in their own way more than anything else because they're so angry. Maybe the other person lied to them. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily abusive, but it's a lie. And so now, you just being deceived is so painful that you can't
Move past it.
put it aside. And it takes a long time to get over those kind of pains. Like it's not like it comes so easily, but you have to work on it. And you have to work on it in front of your children.
Yeah, my takeaway from listening to your commentary right now is, like, from an emotional standpoint, again, from my lens, is that they get stuck emotionally, whether
They
through
get
anger.
totally stuck.
Yeah, and that's what's getting in the way. Just listening to you. At least that's my working theory, listening to what you're saying. Of course, everybody's
It's
different.
true.
Mhm.
So you're a soccer mom and you've been in every single game and every single practice and everything. And you would talk to your husband about it at night, or the father of the child. And now he has to know all the schedules. And if he wants to go, he gets to go to all the games, so as he would have before. So now he chooses to go and you're mad because he's choosing to go, or he's choosing to go with his girlfriend, which is dumb on his part, but maybe throwing it in your face. So there's so many things that people don't realize, like, yes, we have the computers now, we have internet. It is very easy to give someone else information. Why are people so stuck on not giving the father or mother of this child the information? It
Yeah,
doesn't make sense.
yeah, that's not helpful. And it may be driven by just revenge, spite, defensiveness, whatever it is, but it sounds like emotional stuff getting in the way for them.
And guardian ad litems read it. I mean, I read Talking Parents in our Family Wizard all the time, and it's shocking to me that people actually, excuse me 1 minute,
Okay.
um, that people know you're reading it and they don't care. And so one of the rules I do is there, in Talking Parents or any of those, my rule when I do it is each message has to be less than 10 sentences, can only have one subject in it. It needs to be professional. I don't always get the professional, but I often get the one subject. And so when people have to write 5 different Our Family Wizards on 5 different subjects for 10 sentences or less, they tend to write less because it's too much work.
It's great. That
So
is great.
I try to do shortcuts.
That's great guidance. Is there anything
Well,
that with your years of experience that you would want younger, or maybe not younger, but any attorney to know for the sake of helping cases, like as a guardian ad litem, are there things that you've experienced over the years that have frustrated you about the behavior of the professional, the legal professional,
yes,
that you
often.
would love for them to know and do better?
Well, I think that, and I think this has gotten worse over the years too. You didn't marry the other person. Don't take on the personality of your client. Don't believe everything they say, unless you have proof of it. They just, and it's not, one of the things that people forget is it's not the guardian's job to fix it. It is the guardian's job to report it and make recommendations. And so a lot of people say things like, why didn't you tell me that before? Well, it wasn't my job to do that. Sometimes parents just should be smarter. If I can't help, I will, but that's not my job. So, people will call me and ask me, like, what do I do? And I may come up with something pragmatic for them to do. But, and so I'm in a few cases where TikTok has become an issue, or before that, MySpace has become an issue, or Facebook has become an issue. And one of the things and children are getting phones much earlier and they're not being watched. And one of the things I try to tell people, and it's been a problem in so many cases, and the 7 to 8 o'clock phone calls, I actually mediated a case, and this I thought was almost shocking, but it says that you can make a phone call between 7 and 8. One of the parents decided that they're supposed to be able to talk to the child from 7 to 8, and the child is 6.
I have that exact case I have as a therapist for the mom. I am the
It's
therapist.
insane. It's
And
insane.
she doesn't know how. I'm trying to help her on how to navigate that, and how does she have to comply and cooperate with the belief that he has that he gets the whole hour with her daughter, who's like all over the place and doesn't want to talk to the dad on the, like, it's
No,
her.
I personally don't think that, I mean, it depends on the age, obviously, but the younger the child, their focus is not that long. And so,
I wonder if this is the same.
no, it's insane.
Yeah.
It just makes no sense. It's just, why are you doing that to your 5-year-old?
Yeah.
I did have a client that did, I mean, I did have a client that did something that was really smart, though. This was probably 10, 15 years ago. So she had a 2 and a 4-year-old. Talk about getting hard for them to focus. So what she would do is she would tape her phone or whatever it was, like when it was originally when they were little in the kitchen, to the kitchen chair so they could walk around. Then she would just like stick it with command strips or whatever to the wall in the child's room. So the child would go in, they could play show and tell. It still wasn't an hour phone call, but at least she wasn't watching them. She wasn't having to hold the phone for them. They were free to talk and run around and whatever. And it was brilliant. I thought she was brilliant. I wish I had thought of it.
That's great. Wow.
You got to accommodate. So what I tell people with children that have their own phones is at 8 o'clock, phone goes off, it goes in the kitchen, you plug it in and buy them a alarm clock. Because it is not healthy for your children to have their phones in their rooms at night because
Yeah,
you have no control of what they're looking at.
it's yes, absolutely. That is so
And unfortunately, most people do not heed that advice.
yeah.
Just
That's
like they don't heed the advice that you're not supposed to be on Facebook or TikTok or Instagram or any of those things if you're younger than 13.
yeah.
Parents don't care. They think it's easier.
I know. It's so they just really don't have an appreciation and understanding of the impact. Um,
And, it's funny. If you look at the first 2 months of the pandemic, I think there are children that will tell you it was one of the best times of their lives because for 2 months, they got to be with their parents or the siblings not running anywhere. Not everyone's like that. And yes, it went way too long. Those first couple of months, I think children really enjoyed being with their family.
yeah, absolutely. That was such a it in that regard, it was such a great time. It was a horrific time for every other
Right.
reason, but
In every other way, it was horrible. But for those couple of months, I think that children really enjoyed that people were home with them.
yeah, yeah. Um, so are there other things that are important for you, whether it be the parents, the children, the professionals working with families through divorce that you want to share in regards to the wisdom you've gained over the years of working in this field, that you want people to know?
Um, I think that attorneys not listen, everybody makes mistakes. Guardians see things different ways. We're all human. But if we are constantly telling a lawyer, it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, it's a duck. And stop trying to prove us wrong. See what you could do to help it because it is the kids. Like if you two want to fight as adults and fight over money candlesticks, God bless you. But if you want to fight about these kids and just buy into what your client's saying, you're doubling down and it's not helpful. And there's unfortunately it's hard as lawyers to, because I played that role too. It's hard and there are guardians that miss it. They miss the whole picture. And sometimes that too as a lawyer standpoint. And what do you do with that?
And but if
That's hard.
guardians miss it, are those, I mean, if you've ever experienced in whatever way that you've experienced that insight of some guardians missing it, are those guardians in those kind of cases trying to say to the attorneys something that is very misdirected? Like, is it possible that attorneys are like, what are we having difficulty deciphering? What do I follow? What do I not? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I think some of it, like I had a case as I was a lawyer for one party, and the guardian went, and the children had actually complained about their fathers having drugs around and alcohol around and driving with an open container, and they complained to the school and the therapist, etc. And the guardian Litem found the box that he kept the weed in, and he was basically, well, it smells like it, but there's nothing in there, so it's not a problem. And she didn't, and even though the children were also, no question, aligned with the mother because the mother just couldn't get out of her own way. This was a real problem, and there is no perfect person. So you've got to put both out there. You can't ignore it and just say, well, it was empty now, so it's fine. These children have told you that they found it for 2 years constantly. You can't ignore it because why are these children 10 and 12 reporting this to the school and the therapist and everyone else. Like, kids don't do that. They lose interest.
Well, now you've just made me think about a topic that I would like your comment on. So that makes me think about parental alienation. Like, what if that was parental alienating behavior and they'd been talking about it for 2 years because the mom is continually encouraging and pushing them to see things that are not necessarily really factual, but that she's trying to really like create a profile to help keep dad at bay so she maintains access and control to her kids for whatever reason. But as an example of
It's a
what,
problem.
so
It,
yes.
it's huge. It's huge. And it's not always fixed because people, and I totally get this. People want to be cautious. And so if someone makes really, really harsh allegations, it's hard to ignore them, even if they're not factual. And if they, and sometimes they are, but a child doesn't even have to know about them. In this particular case, the children saw it without the mom even around. And they saw gummies and they saw this. So, and so did the guardian. She just said it's not a big deal because it's not there anymore, which I think sort of defeats the whole thing, because that means you're not hearing the children. And
Right.
so it goes back to the same thing as a guardian, and that is, yeah, there are definitely, like, I'm watching this with one of three children that are becoming alienated from one of the parents. And but if there's a parenting coordinator and there's a judge and there's a guardian, they're all saying things and you're not listening to them, there's not more I could do. And that's really the problem. I report it, I make my recommendations. Sometimes parties make their own agreements and the agreement was different, and sometimes they're happy with it and sometimes they're not. And if the people don't listen to the experts at all, and all the experts are on the same side, it's a problem.
Yeah,
And it's not something that as a guardian you could cure it.
would a guardian ever make a recommendation for a reunification therapist or make a report that includes parental alienation as part of the
All
report?
the time. All the time.
Do you have certain criteria that you base the identification of parental alienation? Or it's just based on experience and training and knowledge and
Um, I think some of the criteria you use is what someone might say to the teachers, might say to the parents. Some of it, there is criteria, because I can't just do it because somebody said to me they don't like the other person.
right.
You've got to have a lot of information that points to it before you could say that.
Right.
So,
But is there a certain either statute, definition, or criteria from not from the DSM, but criteria from somewhere as objective criteria that you use as your measuring stick in your report to point out the fact that this behavior is indicating alienation, parental alienation? Or it's just yes, there's criteria, but it's been based on your years of experience that you create, you build a case based on the information, but there's no necessary definition, statute, or
I think alienation takes so many different forms that it would be hard to be totally criteria oriented. But I also think most alienators, pure alienators, are not careful. And so they'll tell the school, they'll tell the doctor, I was a guardian in a case where the case has been litigated for the last 10 years. And one party continues to say all these horrible things about the other parent. And during the pandemic, one parent didn't let the child to the other parent at all. And then ended up being a year later. And then she made all these allegations that no one in the school believed. Nobody from the therapist believed. DCF didn't believe. Like there was such a pattern that and so the first day of reunification, you would never even know this kid was separated from our parent. It was just automatic that it was cool, all was fine. And so, unfortunately, sometimes because of the cluttering of the court system, or like the pandemic caused so much alienation to happen because people had different rules of what should be and whether you should. And the amount of parents that kept kids from their other parent for a year and a half, it's a long time at a young age.
Yes.
And so I don't know if it's a criteria, but this is what I will tell parents. And I've seen this over and over again. The person that talks the most negative about the other parent over years is the person that will be resented by the child when they get older.
Yes.
And I've seen that over and over and over again. These children just want to be children. They don't want you just ripping apart your spouse or ex-spouse or their father or their mother. And they will resent it. And you're going to be the person they're going to be mad at. They're not going to be mad at the person you talked about.
That is such an excellent point to make. And I absolutely concur and have experienced that time and time again with all the clients I've ever worked with in therapy, honestly.
I've had it with people that I'm friends with that have nothing to do with it, who have expressed to me that, and people just use bad judgment of what their children are watching. Like if you're married and you want to marry somebody else, don't have a ceremony that your children's involved in until you're divorced. And then when you do have a ceremony and you are already divorced, have your child as part of it, because that's a big moment. And people just don't get it.
Yeah.
They don't get it. They don't have the patience. And it's hard. It's exhausting. Especially, you work for people who work full time. It's exhausting. And children ask a million questions, and it's hard, but it's also how they thrive.
Yeah.
And if you're not sure and you don't want to be resentful, or you don't really, rather than lash out, say to your child, I need to think about it. And then go back to it later when you could give a good answer. The same thing with regard to expenses. Someone wants to send their child to, South America for a trip to dig, and the other parent can't afford it or doesn't think that that's a good place for them to go. Don't answer that your dad won't let you do it or your mom won't let you do it. Like that doesn't help either.
Yeah.
And the resentment you think that's going to be long term on the other parent isn't going to really exist.
Yeah. Exposing the kids to the decisions between parents, whether together or apart. Yeah, I mean, actually, even together too. That's problematic. It doesn't really matter. The ideal situation is to present as a united front, and not to undermine the value, the input of each other. Like not to even expose that stuff. It's just usually.
The theory behind co-parenting and shared parental responsibility is, the real theory behind it is, when you were married, at night before you went to bed or when you were arranging or whatever, you talked about what happened during the day and your children's stuff. The theory is you're doing the same thing, you're just in separate houses. And the people that could do that well, their children come out much healthier than the people that can't.
Yeah.
Is there any disagreements when you're married?
Is there anything you would want kids to know that through your years of experience, that, if you could share certain messages with kids going through divorce that you would want them to know?
I want them to know that they matter. I want them to know that their feelings matter. Their thoughts matter. And I want them to know that it's not forever. and they're going to grow up and they're going to see things when they have relationships and they get married or choose not to get married or have children or choose not to have children, just have nieces or nephews, that they will sometimes understand more why people are behaving the way they are, because it's not so easy. And it's not easy to always to get divorced, and it's not easy as an adult. And so sometimes things slip that people don't intentionally mean to, or, or only in the moment. And I also think both parents and children need to learn how to say, I'm sorry, or I made a mistake, without them thinking that they're not going to be looked at the same way, because I think they're going to be looked at better.
It's a nice message. Yes, good point.
Yeah.
What
You
does,
know,
to you, what does success look like as a guardian ad litem? Like, what cases do you walk away from feeling good about? What was it about the case that, where you feel you've succeeded?
I think I feel like I succeeded when I make a recommendation or I do my research and I explain it to both sides and they recognize. So there was a case that I have that's pretty complex, and there had to be a psychological evaluation of this brilliant child who had crazy issues, but when you met her, you like fell in love with her. But there had been issues her whole life growing up, and they did a psychological evaluation. And when it came back, I said to the parents, do you see any of yourself in that report? And not just what they said, but the outcome and the results. And both of them said, we see a little bit of both of us in it, which I thought was a wonderful response, because they recognized their own parts in some of, like, I think this child got the worst of both of them, unfortunately. But they recognized it.
Well,
And
and
I thought that was the
that
success.
question you asked was a wonderful question too, for the sake of helping them to see their part and not part, we do have an influence on our kids, whether we like it or not. But in terms of the scope of your role and how to help them, it's a great question.
I also think a really important thing for guardians to note is your friends and your help, your real help is the doctors, the dentists, teachers. Most grandmas or aunts or whatever are going to say about their own people. Not every so often they'll go and back the other side, but most often, like, what
Yeah.
are they going to say to me? And I get that. And so that doesn't mean you discount it, but you also you have to rate everything just like a judge will, relevancy. And one of the things I also note is that if a parent gives me a witness list and the only witnesses that they have on it are their parent, sister, or brother, I often think that's a problem. I also think it's a problem if I ask for people and they, like, there's a case where I said, I need to know the doctors from the beginning. So the child's 6, it's not that complicated because one party's changed the doctors, otherwise they were the same doctors. And they never did it. They never gave it to me, or they only put their doctors on there. And that's not what I want. And that's not what I asked for. And I think parents need to be aware of giving guardians the information that they could use to help you. Like, I'm not here to start a war. I'm here to try to help you. And I try really hard to get people to do this before my report comes out. Because once my report comes out, it's there and it
Do you
stinks.
understand why now, me working with individuals who've been through the ringer already by the time they get to you, do you understand why you would get resistance and paranoid guarded behavior though, right? Like you
100%.
Yeah.
100%. But I also think that, like, sometimes I'm in a case for a short time, but when I'm in a case for a really long time, you should know me by now.
Right.
And
Yes.
one of the things that I find a lot, which is interesting, is that because I really am about being pragmatic, I like when I tell someone that their child wants them to be a knight in shining armor, that's got nothing to do with any of the statute books. That's got nothing to do with anything other than this is how your daughter looks at you, and you want her to still look at you that way. So you may want to be careful of what you say, or you may want to be careful about your girlfriend being around. Um, you may want to be careful about what the children call her. And that's not always because of the mom or the dad. Sometimes it's just because of you want to make it easier for the children. And they don't realize that. Like they want their new spouse, their new partner to be the mom or the dad or the mommy or the poppy, but that makes it harder on your children. I say, come up with a fake name. Call them Susan, call them Aunt Shirley, call them whatever you want. Just don't call them mom or dad. And you could say, come on, what do you want us to call you? Let's come up with like a fun name. Come up with something cute.
Yeah.
You can make it fun. When you're going into a new house and you need to buy furniture for your kids' rooms and sheets, let them come with you to pick out their sheets so they make it their room. It's not that difficult. You're emotionally wrecked. Take a step back. And even though your kid may get sheets today that they're going to hate tomorrow, just get the sheets. If that's what's going to make them happy that day. And that doesn't, and also be consistent. If you always punished your child, or made sure your child got their homework done and now you're not doing it, you have to make their life has to remain consistent. They could cry, they could be upset, you could tell them they could eat a pint of ice cream, but they need to get the things done. Your line has to stay the same because that's what makes them crazy when your line's not the same.
Right.
And also one example that actually is my own is my daughter used to walk into her math class in third grade and say, my heart hurts. And I went to her third grade teacher and I said, I'm getting a divorce. It's not so good. She doesn't have a heart problem. She's just sad. And people don't really just tell, you don't have to give the teachers the information that someone's bad or good. But when a child walks and says, my heart hurts, they may think they have a heart issue. Like, just let them know what's going on because teachers will see the differences in your child's behavior and you want to know.
Yeah. Yep.
And you want to know without being antagonistic.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's doable if you want to do it. Everyone has to want their children to be healthy more than they want to punish the other party.
That's a really valuable point to, I think, a highlight of, helping parents through what you've seen in your career. Yeah. So
it's important. We're here to protect the children. That's it. I have no stake in it. I don't. And that's something also, that parents don't always realize, or lawyers, like, I don't have a stake in this. I am reporting what I see and hear. I didn't make it up. I normally have documents to back it up. And tell parents to be very careful what they put on social media because a guardian's going to find it. Even if they make up a fake name, we're going to find it. We're going to research it.
And what would your advice be to parents going through a divorce regarding social media? Knowing what
Get off it. Get off it.
Okay, that's very
while you're in the middle of the divorce, get off it because your emotions are going to take over. Let your girlfriends get off it, your boyfriends get off it, get off it.
That makes
Because
sense.
as secret as you think it is, they're always so easy to. I remember that someone took their 2-year-old, oh my God, and hung them on a fish hook behind a bathroom door as a cute picture. I got that it was a cute picture, but I also get that that's a crazy thing to do. I'll tell you something else. When your little kid's on the toilet reading the paper, like everybody takes a picture of a child doing that, or like you're doing cute little things and they may not have your underwear on or whatever, and you're not being anything wrong. But if you send that picture or video to another country, you are now in trouble with the law. So I try to tell people, like, now is not the time just don't do it now. Wait, it's not going to matter. Keep the pictures for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Get
Yeah.
off social media. Get off it. It's not a good example for your kids either.
So
Or read stuff, but don't post.
yeah, but even I think your advice is actually is really good no matter what, because even just reading stuff, if you're vulnerable, if you're struggling emotionally
True.
through the divorce process, it may trigger you and then you may react in ways that you regret.
That's true. You're right. You're right. I mean, and look, we didn't have social media for a million years. Going off for a year is not going to kill you.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Oh my God. In fact, it probably would save you in many ways, many more ways than just the divorce. Imagine if we went
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, for a year.
you know, I learned this interesting thing about going to the hospital and going to see someone at the hospital. And you sit there and you're not really sure what to say, right? You sit there for 15 minutes, an hour, and then what do you talk about? So a friend of mine started, and I once went and we brought one of the little boxes of Trivial Pursuit. So we got to play with them, and therefore you got to ignore everything else. Well, it's the same with children. Like I I used to only meet them in bookstores. There's not as many bookstores around, however. But that way they could pull a book. You don't ask them about their parents. Ask them about their favorite book. Ask them about who's their favorite teacher. Do they have a best friend? What do they like doing? Like ask a million things. It will come around, or ask subtly how, what did it used to look like? What did it look like when you guys were at the table? What mom cooked for dinner? What dad cooked for dinner? Did you bring on a lot? What's your favorite? Make it fun. Don't make, and it's harder with teenagers because they know everything.
Yeah.
But and be careful. Don't always blame the other parent. Sometimes they're learning things like just you gotta be thorough. I think the answer is be thorough, be kind. Being kind is actually at the top of my list. Be
Mhm.
kind. And most people will be responsive to kindness or and I will tell you, and this really could go home to parents and to guardians. So I started on this case, and one parent kept complaining that the children would come home and say, mommy said, or daddy said this about you, and daddy said this about you, and daddy said this about you. And I would make a list of what the child said without even asking. The mom would say this. And then it started shifting, and the dad would say, the mom said this, and the mom said this, and this. So I actually made a list of what the mom first said was said, and the dad first said was said. And I met the dad for brunch, and I brought the list, and I said, it's exactly the same. I mean, almost to the word, exactly the same. So if you didn't want mom to believe it when she said it, why are you believing it now?
Hmm.
Kids aren't that creative. They're going to use the same arguments. They worked for one house for a while. They don't work there anymore. They'll use the same ones in the other house to get to not do homework but if the kids are doing poorly in school and they always did well, or they start acting up and they never did before, those are things that a guardian learns from the teachers. I believe in teachers.
Oh, you just made me. I have one other. Well, I could go on and on, but I have one question I did is as a guardian ad litem, when you're working, you will interface with kids. Are there certain circumstances that you will definitely recommend a therapist for a child going through a divorce? And what is it? What are what's your thing, your criteria for which you would be like, your kids need to see start seeing a therapist?
They need a voice. They need to have someone listen to them. They need to have
You
somebody who
see that
hears them.
not when you see their needs are not being met, their voice is not being heard, you will recommend a therapist for them because they need a space and outlet to be able to share what's going on and process.
And sometimes parents are going to change, so the children have to learn how to cope with their parents.
So
It's not
that
always vice versa.
is there ever a circumstance that you so what's the, the level of like the frequency of which you recommend therapy? Is it almost in every case? Because your cases are majority high conflict. No, so no, not necessarily. So what are the things?
And I'm going to tell you, let me just say this also. If you know that a child and they're, let's say, and I'm using 6 or 7, 5, 6 or 7 as my base for the moment,
Okay.
and you see that they've already spoken to therapists, psychological evaluator, parenting court, whatever, a million different people. Sometimes I'll meet with them once and not meet with them again because I feel like they've told their story enough times. They don't need to repeat the story over and over again. And so that's very rare, but on occasion it happens. But sometimes I'll recommend a
Sorry.
sometimes I'll recommend a therapist for a child to connect to if I can. And then they may go for a month or two and not go again, but they know they have this person there if they need them. So it's not always because they need them that minute, but you suspect they may need it in the future. So you want them to have a body that they could say, and I've had that happen where kids have gone to therapy and nothing's happened. And then 3 months later, they'll say, oh my God, mom, I need to go see, Dr. Son and Dr. Fabricant. And they'll walk in and they'll be like, oh my God, I lied to you about everything, and just like it'll come out and they know they have a safe space. But I don't think every child needs to because every child isn't always going to understand. But most kids, I guess, I think it's 50-50. I don't think I always have kids have to go through that because of their parents
Right. It just,
stuff.
what I'm hearing from you is it depends, but there's circumstances for which I'm hearing you would, and maybe there's certain things that you wouldn't. It's your discretion.
Well, it's also like, let's assume you have a child who's so involved with school that they have all these activities and they're doing great and they're doing amazing. Like, you don't want to keep taking time away from them when they're social and their grades are great. And even though it's affecting them, not everybody could afford a therapist, not everybody could afford a guardian, not everybody could afford to go to court, but some kids are just good at being able to digest it all. And some kids are going to be very resentful of a therapist and will go later in life. Like, it's really hard and it really depends on the age. And, and there's also a lot of people that don't want to go near divorce cases anymore.
Yeah. You're talking
People
about
have gotten
therapists that don't.
therapists, right? Therapists, guardians, lawyers. I mean, it's become so nasty. I mean, I've seen some things that have been written to people that are just, and they're questioning their children. I think if the people would question their children less, their children will do better.
Yeah, because that can be detrimental, absolutely, for them, for the kids.
And they do it. And that's the biggest problem is stop asking your stop asking your child what they ate at the other person's house. People say to me, oh my God, they gave him ice cream for dinner. I said, that's okay. It has calcium in it. Like, that's not the biggest deal in the world. Who cares?
Right.
If your child's obese, I might care. But other than that,
yeah,
who cares?
Yep.
And these charts sometimes that the doctors use, they're not wrong. But if you have a kid that is 5 and short and plump, and in 2 years may grow 6 inches, and like, you got to also work with their ages and everything and not be so insanely crazy.
Yep. Right. It's not this micro focus. You've got to put it in the context of a bigger picture, which is similar to the example that I was giving you feedback about, this one incident of burning a piece of napkin. Who cares? But
Right.
so I want to ask.
Now, it matters if that same child burned and said, I want to burn down the house, that would be a different set of circumstances.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And people they don't, but if they were married, they'd say, oh my God, could you, like, no, you don't get to play with napkins, put it out. And that would be the end of it. You wouldn't think that they were a pyromaniac because of it. If you're going through a divorce, you might. So it's insane.
Yeah.
People have got to keep their stuff in check for children.
Yeah, that's the,
But remember what I said, the percentage of people that are in the high conflict cases with regard to kids are actually very small. They're just in everyone's face. The same thing with DCF or you know, there are always these bad stories, but there's never the good stories. And there are good stories.
oh yeah, absolutely. But I do think that you can learn so much from worst case scenarios and big mistakes. And so I think there's a great value. You know, it's not my interest to work with high conflict parenting, co-parenting, divorce cases. But there's so much to be learned from it. And that can really help those that have the potential that they're going down the wrong road, or a road that can become more and more problematic, and you see the potential of that, to share the wisdom of what that road looks like way down the road. And
Right.
that's your terrain. You're way down that road, and you do a lot of amazing work. So there's so much
Oh,
to
thank
gain
you.
from your insight and from, yeah, you're welcome, from your experience.
I
Well, I want to
think
ask
one
you.
of the things one more thing is that what I've learned in my own also when I bringing up my daughter was less is more.
Yes.
You don't need to give your children all the details. You do not always have to argue with them. Like less is more.
Yeah, that is a great piece of advice for communication. When you're over explaining something, when you're asking way more detail, um, that's problematic. It is. Less is more. Absolutely. Yeah. So, okay, so I want to, for the sake of time, and I'm grateful for the time you're spending with me. You know, I love the collaborative process. I'm very invested in that. I'm curious to know what your perspective is of the collaborative process. Just what your thoughts are of it in relation to mediation, litigation. You know, you've got many years of experience and as an attorney. And I just, to add context, as a mental health therapist, the amount of cases over the period of time that I have of people living lives and what their stories are like, let's say from the 100 cases I have, you as an attorney, as a guardian ad litem, as a mediator, have to the power of 2 or 10 of that. You know, you go through so many more cases, and so you see lives play out in so many more different ways than I would ever. So for me as a mental health, working with attorneys in the arena of divorce, I love to like just hear and get your experience and the knowledge you have, because you see so many cases play out in so many different ways, and that gives me perspective. So to that, just adding that context, what's your input about collaborative, what you've learned, what you've seen about it so far in comparison to litigation, mediation?
So as you and I talked about when we were together, like I want to go through a collaborative case from start to the end because I've not seen one from the beginning to the end. I think that from what I've seen of it, I think people can be and lawyers can be collaborative if they choose. I think that the collaborative process is a very good process, but I also don't think, just like the court said, it fits everybody. Um, and so, and I don't think it's always an even playing field. And
In
so,
or just in divorce, or both?
um, it's such a hard question to answer because I think there are cases that are very successful doing it collaboratively. I also think that um, I have to see more of it in action to be able to give a fair answer to it. I think most people will do better if they could come to resolutions on their own. And I've said that to people in mediation all the time. You don't want a judge telling you what you're going to do with your kids. So I do think it's better if they come to that on their own.
Yes.
But I also think that we often end when the case ends, and sometimes they need some things that carry on after the case ends. And how do we get them, and that's not just in collaborative, that's everywhere. How do we get them to look into the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. One of the things I do on the cases I've worked on, if there's a level of conflict or a level of not incompetence, but a lack of co-parenting skill, I will input a co-parenting counselor in the midst of a case so that that co-parenting counselor can be available, similar to like a therapist, that you start a relationship with a therapist. You don't need them all the time, but you have
Right.
established a relationship you can come back to. So that I've done on many cases for the sake of supporting parents past beyond the scope of my work with them. Yeah.
I think that's important. I think that's really important. More so, I think, maybe more so, but differently, because in the collaborative process, I think you spend more time with everybody and then
Yeah.
you're by yourself. And so, you have this great group that's with you as you're going through it, and then they're not anymore.
Yeah. I
So
wonder.
that concerns me.
Yeah. I wonder how they do, but I do, um, my experience, and again, I don't have a lot of high conflict. Like I do parenting coordination, but not too much of it. So typically in that context, there's more high conflict cases. And, but to something you said, this is what my belief and what I observe as far as I can observe it to the end of the case and a little bit after maybe, is that people do better when they have control and agency over their life, and when they can come to when their agreements and their resolutions are a result of their own free will. There is way more resilience and way more empowerment and way more they're fully invested because they've been the one
Right.
to craft and create the decisions of their life. So the potential for them being satisfied and that there's more positive, satisfactory results is there in the collaborative
I
process.
agree with you. I
Yeah.
agree with you. I think that that is absolutely what it's about, is make your own decisions with whoever the other parent is, because
Yeah.
that's what they're going to have to do.
Yeah. Well, now that you've said what you've said, I mean, if you're interested, I will definitely get you to be a note
I
taker.
am interested. I
Yeah.
am interested. I want to see it from beginning to end.
If you genuinely are, I will promise I will put you in touch with um some people that can get you onto a case as a note taker. Yes.
Yeah, I think it would be important to help in my process too with
Yeah.
kids. I think the hardest part with children is that when you get to know them so well and then the case ends, how do you explain to them that you're not coming over anymore to play?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard in your limit because you've got a finite scope of how your purpose.
And
Um,
I really listen to them, so then they don't have this person really listening to them.
yeah. Actually, there's
So
one last
it's
thing I want to say. Have you ever heard of the child specialist, which is a collaborative role? Like in the collaborative process, there's something called the child specialist. Have you ever heard of that?
no.
So
What is it?
you may end up falling in love with that role for yourself. Although I think probably the tendency in the collaborative world would be to always hire a mental health professional. I don't know that it's required, you know. It's the way I understand it is it's the similar scope of a guardian ad litem, but it's absolutely by agreement and interest of the parents that they want to hear by protecting the kids from being exposed to the divorce process. They want to know what their children's interests are, and so they need somebody that's adept and a professional to be able to go in and get a real sense of what's working for them, what's good, what are their needs, how to help them transition through divorce in a and then bring that information back to the team, to the parents, so that they can then negotiate and craft an agreement with that information in place. And that's the role of a child specialist in a collaborative process. So that's something that's newer to South Florida. There's certain parts of the USA where they are really doing this well and have done many, many cases using the child specialist. And like, I'm learning from some of those people. And I know South Florida, like the collaborative community, were really interested in that role and trying to learn how to use it and how to like the scope of it.
I think that's great.
So
Because
yeah,
parents are probably more eager to hear it and will hear it and listen to it than they will in the regular high conflict cases.
yeah.
Right,
So
I would probably love that role.
yeah, I could totally, yeah. And I don't see why it would not be okay for it not to be a mental health. I understand there's more of a clinical potential but I see pros and cons to it, but with so many years of experience of doing guardian ad litem work, I think it would be perfect for that role. And there's no rules around at this point, as I understand it, around a child specialist having to be a mental health professional or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you want someone who could communicate with the children.
Yeah, but also has the understanding of how to interview children and the experience of how to protect them through any kind of litigation, even though collaborative is really not litigation, but through a divorce process. So
Right.
you definitely have the potential to know that and the experience with all your years as a guardian ad litem.
Thank you. It
Yeah,
sounds really like an interesting role.
yeah. So thank you so much. I'm really glad that we had took.
Thank you, Tammy.
Yeah, my pleasure. Um, thank you
And
for,
hopefully I'll get to see you soon.
yeah. Well, we'll definitely be in touch through email and I don't know, like I'm gonna let you know about the child specialist training if it comes to Florida. And yeah, I hope to see you around, like for whatever reasons we can find to meet together, and we'll definitely do
We
breakfast.
will find reasons, even if it's just because we want to.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So good to see you.
Good to see you. Have a great weekend.
You too. Take care.
Talk to you soon.
All right. You too.
Bye bye.
Bye.